This is that fast.
Don't read this if you've never felt too small to do something great for God. You've never wondered why God chooses the weak. You think only the strong are used by Him to perform miracles. You're not ready for your faith to be challenged at its very root. Why 300? Why did God choose to win in such a strange way? No swords, no spears, no bloodshed. If you're wrestling with doubt, would you dare to step out at the sound of His call? What if it were me? Welcome to Prayer Station. Would I stand when the whole world runs, and if you are the one God is calling today, would you dare to believe? This story is not for those living safely. But if you're in the wine press, surrounded by fear, failure, and questions, then maybe God is preparing you for a battle unlike any other. Gideon, a weak, small man hiding in the dark, was the one called to shatter that very darkness. And if that could happen to him, maybe it's happening to you. So if you've ever felt too small to be used by God, if you've ever asked, if the Lord is with me, why is my life in ruins? Then this story is for you. Because God doesn't call the ready. He makes ready the one He calls. And sometimes, a miracle doesn't begin with a trumpet or a sword, but with a trembling heart, threshing wheat in the dark, still willing to listen for the voice from heaven. Israel in darkness. For 7 years, the nation was crushed under the heel of Midian. When harvest came, so did the enemy. They swarmed like locusts, devouring every crop, every flock, every trace of hope. The Israelites were no longer a nation. They were shadows, hiding in caves and rocky dens. Every sound in the wind made their hearts race. Every harvest came with a desperate prayer. Please don't let them find us. And in that very setting we meet Gideon, a young man threshing wheat in a wine press, a place no one would ever use for that purpose. But there, it was safer than the open field. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a leader. Just a son from the smallest family in the smallest tribe, Manasseh. He was trying to hide the last scraps of hope, a few heads of wheat from the enemy's claws, not because he was brave, but because there was no other way to survive. And then, God showed up, not with thunder, not with legions of angels. He came through as an angel sitting beneath a tree, looking into the darkest corner of the most anxious heart, and said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon froze. Mighty warrior, here, now, me? Maybe he looked around to see if someone else was in the wine press, but the angel wasn't mistaken. God never is. He often calls the weak by the very name of what they've not yet become. Gideon burst out, "If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened? Where are the miracles of old? Has God abandoned us? Have you ever asked the same? In pain upon pain, when do your prayers seem to vanish into silence?" Gideon voiced what many of us are too afraid to say, and God didn't get angry. He responded with a call. "Go in the strength you have, I will be with you. You will strike down Midian as if they were one man. From a man in hiding to a man sent, from a heart full of doubt to the first step of faith. No thunder, no glory, just a voice ringing out in a cramped space among crushed wheat and raw fear. But even a voice from heaven still needs a heart on earth willing to answer. Gideon didn't rise instantly like a hero. He still doubted, still trembled, and still had one plea in his heart. Please give me a sign that it is truly you calling me. And God, full of patience, began, step by step, to turn a weak man into his warrior. And that's when the first miracle happened. Not on the battlefield, but on a rock with meat, bread, and fire from heaven. Gideon didn't ask for a plan. He didn't request an army. The only thing he needed was confirmation. If you truly have chosen me, please show me a sign. And God did not reject that request. Gideon stepped into his first act of faith. He prepared an offering, young goat meat, unleavened bread, and broth. Not on a grand altar, not in front of a cheering crowd, but on a quiet stone where this small man cried out to the Holy One. And then, a miracle happened. The angel touched the offering with the tip of his staff. Fire flared up from the rock, consuming it all. The angel vanished, and Gideon fell to the ground, trembling in awe and fear. Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. But God did not want him to die in fear. He wanted him to live in calling. Peace to you. Do not be afraid, you will not die. And in the very place once filled with dread, Gideon built an altar and named it, The Lord is Peace, Maltabunda Yahweh Shalom. From a holy miracle unto obedience in the real world. God gave Gideon his first mission, not to fight a battle, but to destroy the idols in his own house. That was even harder. Not to face enemies outside, but to tear down what his people had come to worship. Gideon was commanded, tear down your father's altar to Baal, cut down the Asherah pole beside it, then build a new altar to the Lord your God on top of this hill. It wasn't just demolition. It was a public declaration in the middle of the night. From now on, this family, this nation will no longer bow to false gods. But Gideon was still afraid. He didn't dare do it by day. He acted at night, quietly, but boldly. He took 10 of his servants. The Asherah pole was cut down. The altar to Baal was smashed. A new altar was built where real fire would once again be lit. When morning light broke, silence shattered. The villagers were furious. They discovered the one who had destroyed their altar was Gideon. They gathered, demanding his life. Bring out your son, so he may die. But then, someone stepped forward, none other than Gideon's father, Joash, the owner of the altar that had been destroyed. And he said a line that silenced the crowd. If Baal is truly a god, let him defend himself. From that day, people called Gideon Jerub-Baal, meaning the one who contends with Baal. And so the man who once trembled in a wine press became the first in his village to stand against false gods. God didn't just break physical altars, he was breaking fear in a man's heart. From a new name, a new life began. Jerub-Baal, the one who once hid, was now a public symbol of confronting what was wrong. But God didn't stop with a sign. He didn't call Gideon just to tear down an altar. The real war was still ahead. The Midianites, numerous as locusts, fierce as desert winds, were on the move, and this time, it wouldn't be quiet obedience in the night, but a face-off with an entire army, armed with nothing but bare hands and trembling faith. But what no one expected was, God wouldn't let Gideon bring the 32,000 men. Instead, he prepared a miracle greater than any fire that had ever risen from a stone. A miracle, born from what seemed like an absurd selection, and a lesson of faith the entire nation would never forget. The news of Gideon's call to resistance spread like wildfire across the dry fields. From distant tribes, brave men gathered. Each carried the hope that after years of oppression, Israel would finally rise again. 32,000 men assembled under the banner of a man they had never seen as a leader. A young man who once hid in a wine press was now the center of a rising rebellion. But then something no one expected happened. God said, "There are still too many." The reason wasn't strategy. It wasn't a lack of food or weapons. It was this: if victory came through 32,000 men, people would claim the glory and forget the one who fought for them. The purification began. Gideon stood before thousands and said the words that froze the entire camp. "Whoever is afraid, let them turn back." Silence. No one wanted to be the first. But then, one by one, they turned. First a group, then another. 22,000 men walked away, carrying with them both the weight of fear and a faith not yet full. Only 10,000 remained, a force reduced by nearly 2/3. Gideon may have thought, perhaps this is enough. But God spoke again. There are still too many. And this time he wasn't speaking about fear, but about awareness. They were led down to a stream. No one knew this was a test from heaven. Some knelt and drank deeply, satisfying their thirst. Others scooped water with one hand, eyes still scanning the horizon, alert. And God chose again, not by human standards, but by his divine sight. Only 300 remained. 300 who stayed watchful through exhaustion. 300 who stayed focused through desire. 300 who kept the heart of a warrior, even in the smallest action. We often think miracles are supernatural interventions. But in this story, the miracle is that God can win with less to reveal more. It was a selection not based on ability, but on availability. And it was here that Gideon had to confront a sobering truth. The battle ahead would not be won through numbers, strength, or tactics, but through total faith in the one who had chosen them. Night fell over that tiny camp. 300 men, no more, were preparing for something no one dared to imagine. A confrontation with an army as countless as locusts filling the valley below. No one said it aloud, but fear flickered behind their eyes. How could 300 stand against tens of thousands? How could a miracle happen when all they had left was faith? And Gideon, the man who once doubted, who once hid in a wine press, now had to step forward. Only one thing held him upright: the promise of God. But even though he was the chosen one, Gideon still had one thing he had yet to overcome: the golden step, the fear of sound in his heart. Before the first. And in that moment, God would do something unexpected, not through a sword, but through a dream. The sky darkened, like the destiny of a nation hanging by a thread. In the stillness of night, all that remained were whispered prayers, the scraping of clay jars, and the pounding heartbeat of 300 men. Across the valley, the flickering fires of the Midianite camp stretched like a sea of flames, endless, menacing, ready to consume the flicker of hope that burned weakly in Israel's camp. Gideon stepped out of the camp. Inside him, another war raged. Not against the enemy, but against himself. Though he had seen signs, though he had witnessed fire consume an offering, though he had gathered the 300 most alert warriors, his heart still trembled. Not from lack of courage, but because he knew tomorrow's battle had no room for error. And then, once more, God came to Gideon, not through thunder, not through dazzling miracles, but through the whisper in the midnight dark. If you're still afraid, go down to the Midianite camp. Listen to what they're saying. Gideon didn't wait for daylight. With his servant Purah, he quietly left camp, slipping through the darkness, step by careful step, breath held tight. Torchlight danced on the tent walls. Shadows of guards loomed. Snoring men drunk on fleeting victory surrounded him like shadows ready to devour. Then he heard it. A soldier recounted a strange dream about a loaf of barley bread rolling into the Midianite camp, crashing into the Tionent and causing it to collapse completely. The second soldier whispered, "That can only be Gideon, the hand of God. He has delivered Midian into his hands." Gideon stood frozen. Cold sweat trickled down his temple. Not out of fear, but because this was the first time he heard the enemy say what he had never dared to believe. From the mouth of the enemy came confirmation of God's promise. Gideon needed nothing more. He knelt on enemy soil in the darkness in the middle of the enemy's camp and worshipped. He now knew this battle wasn't about him. It was about the name of the Lord. Gideon ran back to camp as if fire burned in his bones. When he arrived, the 300 men still sat in silence, sharpening jars, adjusting torches, waiting for a signal that had yet to come. He stepped onto a rock, his eyes no longer afraid but ablaze. "Get up. The Lord has given the Midianite camp into our hands." Not a military plan, not a strategy drawn by seasoned generals, but a command from heaven. Under the pale moonlight, as the heavy breath of 300 men merged with the rhythm of footsteps pressing forward, Gideon was no longer the man who once trembled in the winepress. He had heard the dream from the mouth of his enemies, had bowed in worship in the heart of enemy ground, and now he returned reborn by faith. No need for a grand strategy. No need for advanced weapons, no need for a massive army. Only one thing was needed: absolute obedience, and that would open the next chapter, where the light of 300 torches would pierce the darkness, where clay jars would shatter like fear breaking apart, and the blast of trumpets would drive the entire Midianite army into chaos. The battle didn't begin with swords, it began with faith. And right after this, you'll see how a strategy from heaven turned empty hands into victorious warriors. Not a single soldier was given a sword. Not a single shield was issued. Gideon did not stand before an elite army. He stood before 300 men chosen by how they drank water. They were not impressive, not powerful, not many. But they had one thing. They were willing to believe. As the night blanketed the valley of Midian, the enemy camp lay silent, as if asleep in a victory already assumed. But on the edge of the horizon, in the shadows, a small flame waited to erupt. Not from a torch, but from a heaven-born plan so wild it could only have come from God. The 300 were split into 3 groups. In their hands were ordinary items: a trumpet, a clay jar, and a torch hidden inside. No one knew why. No one dared ask. There was only one instruction: obey. Gideon didn't give long speeches. He simply said, "When I blow my trumpet, you blow your S. When I break my jar, you break yours. And then shout together for the Lord and Gideon." A plan that seemed absurd. But in that absurdity was pure faith. Not needing to understand, only to trust. Not needing to be strong, only to step forward. Then, the moment came. Gideon raised his hand. One trumpet pierced the night like a call from the heavens. Then another, thundering like waves of lightning splitting the darkness. The crack of shattered jars, sharp and loud like swords slashing into battle. torches blazed into the black, lighting up the valley like an army from heaven had descended. 300 voices, one cry, "For the Lord! For Gideon!" The Midianites woke in chaos. Trumpets roared from every side. Light surrounded them from all directions. The shout shook the mountains. They thought they were under attack by tens of thousands. In their panic, they couldn't tell friend from foe. They turned on each other with their swords. Not a single Israelite had to strike a blow, because this wasn't man's battle, it was the Lord's. And as the torchlight blazed across the valley, one truth became clear. Gideon, the man who once threshed wheat in hiding, was now standing tall in the night, watching a miracle unfold through nothing but obedience. The first victory was theirs, not by blade, but by unshakable faith. But the path of faith never ends with a single miracle. As the enemy fled and those who had once stood far off now rushed to join in, Gideon would face a harder reality. Could he hold firm when his people turned away? Would his faith keep burning when the miracle faded into memory? And all that remained were dust, exhaustion, and cold rejection? The story is not over yet, as the faint glow of that first victory had yet to fade. Gideon refused to rest, because he knew, though the enemy was scattered, it was not yet destroyed, and a halfway victory could be the seed of a greater, more brutal return. Gideon, with the 300 who had stood firm in the night, now began a new journey, a pursuit not only on foot, but one fueled by courage and relentless endurance that defied human limits. They chased the fleeing Midianite troops through dusty valleys and sun-scorched ravines where the enemy's footprints still lingered in the wind. But this time the challenge did not come from the enemy. It came from their people. When Gideon arrived at Succoth and Peniel, 2 Israelite cities, he didn't ask for swords. He didn't demand reinforcements. He only asked for bread, for those who had fought through the night without rest. But the people there looked at him with suspicion. "Have you captured the kings of Midian yet? If not, why should we help you?" No bread, no water. Fear had made them prefer neutrality with the enemy over faith in a miracle still unfolding. To Gideon, this was more painful than the battlefield, to have his faith rejected by his nation. But he did not stop. He did not argue. He did not lash out. He simply replied, "The Lord will hand them over to me, and when he does, I will return." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise from a man who knew that victory didn't come from human approval, but from God's confirmation. And so they pressed on, hungry, tired, rejected. Across the Jordan, Gideon knew only 15,000 enemy troops remained, a number that is still 50 times the number of soldiers. But he hadn't been afraid with 300 against hundreds of thousands. And he wasn't afraid now. Gideon led his men across the Jordan to Karkor, launching a surprise attack along an unexpected path, unguarded, unanticipated. The ambush was swift, decisive, and complete. The 2 kings, Zeba and Zalmunna, once ordered Gideon's brother to be killed, and now there is nowhere to escape. Now 2 people who once offered their hair to his family have been captured alive. There was no cheering, no fist raised in triumph, because this victory was not just the fall of an army. It was a collision with past pain, embodied in 2 breathing men. A journey that had started with the voice of an angel had now led Gideon to this moment, a confrontation between justice and grief. He stood amid the labored breaths of 300 weary warriors, and the terrified eyes of two kings who once held his brothers' lives in their hands. But in that moment, a new test emerged, no longer a battle on the field, but a war inside the heart of the one anointed by God. How would Gideon face his past? How would he carry out justice? How would he honor the calling of a leader anointed with holy oil? The answer awaits in the next chapter. Victory was sealed by the complete collapse of the Midianite army. The land that once groaned under plunder now overflowed with songs of joy and the rising incense of thanksgiving offerings. Gideon, the man who once hid in a winepress out of fear, was now hailed by all as a deliverer, a man anointed by God in a time of chaos. In that moment of celebration, the people came to him, not just with gratitude, but with a proposal for power. Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian. A dynasty, a throne, a glorious legacy was laid at his feet. And miraculously, Gideon, the same man who once trembled and asked for a sign on a fleece, stood firm and rejected what many dream of their whole lives. I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. That refusal rang like thunder on a summer day, resolute, full of faith. It wasn't just humility. It was the spiritual declaration that Israel did not need a human king. They already had the Lord as their sovereign. But then, amidst the refusal of a throne, Gideon asked for something else, not power but gold. He requested that each person offer a single earring from their plunder, a seemingly harmless request. Who wouldn't want to give a gift to their hero? Gold was poured out like water. Earrings, chains, the robes of Midianite kings. Everything was gathered, heaped into a pile. And from that pile, Gideon crafted an ephod, a sacred garment once worn by the high priest, a symbol of seeking the Lord's guidance. At first, perhaps it was well-intended, a sacred token meant to commemorate the miraculous intervention of the Lord. But over time, that sacred object ceased to be a means of seeking God and became an idol. The people began to worship the ephod. What was once a reminder of God became the object of their devotion. The sacred was distorted. The miraculous was replaced by superstition. Faith was forgotten beneath the golden dust of materialism and distorted religion. The Lord had granted victory through an army of just 300 men, but the human heart faltered in the trial of glory. Gideon, the man who once tore down Baal's altar, now unintentionally laid the foundation for a new kind of misdirected worship. Though he refused the throne, his actions opened an invisible trap, one where the people no longer lifted their eyes to heaven but fixed them on what they could touch. And that was when gold replaced glory, idols stood in place of presence, and hearts turned away from God. The victory was thunderous, but what followed was a slow decline. Israel entered 40 years of peace, but it was also 40 years where the roots of faith began to crack. Gideon died, and immediately after, the people fell back into old patterns, worshiping idols, forgetting God, forgetting the one who once fought for them. There was no gratitude for the house of Jerubbaal, living memory of the glorious miracle. The greatest glory of a person isn't in the victory they win, but in how they preserve their faith after the victory. But Gideon, though a hero, was still just a man, and his story closes with a sobering warning that miracles may lead to faith, but only faithfulness keeps the heart from drifting. And if this were merely a hero's tale, perhaps it would have ended there, with triumph, honor, a general retiring in peace. But the Bible doesn't just tell stories. It exposes the human heart and declares the eternal truth of God. Gideon's journey from trembling in a winepress to leading a victorious nation. It is not just for admiration, but for reflection. To reflect on our doubts. At times we felt unworthy, and on those fragile moments after success when glory begins to shake the foundations of our faith. So then, what is Gideon's real miracle? Was it simply the victory of 300 over 135,000 troops? Or is there something deeper that God is teaching us through each chapter of this story? Now is the time to look again, deeper, into your own heart. Come with us to the next part, where we don't just listen, but learn how to live from what God has done through a man called Gideon. Most of us remember Gideon for his victory with 300 men. But if you only focus on that moment of glory, you'll miss a far greater miracle, the miracle of a transformed man. Gideon didn't start as a warrior. He started as a fearful man, an ordinary farmer, a soul in hiding. And that was exactly why God chose him. Because God doesn't look for the already strong. He looks for those willing to obey. Gideon didn't have enough faith. He kept asking for signs. He questioned. He doubted. He was afraid. But he still moved. He still obeyed. Even if his faith was only the size of a mustard seed. The real miracle wasn't just in the final victory. It began the moment Gideon tore down the idol in the night. The moment he blew the trumpet with trembling hands. The moment he said yes to a plan the world would call crazy. God didn't need 32,000 men. He just needed one person bold enough to take the first step. And that truth still holds for you today. You don't need to be impressive. You don't need to be the strongest, smartest, or wealthiest. You just need to be someone who believes enough to obey. Maybe you're in the winepress of your life right now, hiding, confused, wondering, why is this happening? Where is God? He's right there, in the very moment you thought was your end, and if you listen closely, you just might hear him whisper, I am with you, mighty warrior. And that's not just a word for Gideon. It's a word for you if you dare to believe that God can use your smallness to write a story of great victory. And if even now, your heart is still trembling because the story of a man who once hid in a winepress but was used by God to scatter an army, then maybe God is calling you too, not to look back at the past, not to admire miracles from a distance, but to step into your battle. Because the God of yesterday, today, and forever still chooses the weak to do something great. And if you're ready not just to listen, but to respond, then go to the final part, because that part was written for you. Have you ever felt too small for a big dream? Ever thought, surely God can't use someone like me? But remember, Gideon wasn't a warrior when his story began. He was just a man trying to survive, full of doubts and fears. Yet he obeyed, and God did the rest. God doesn't need you to be strong to begin. He just needs you to be willing to obey. And now, if Gideon's story has stirred something inside you, a forgotten dream, a buried calling, then maybe it's time for you to blow the trumpet, break the jar, lift the torch, and rise. Let this prayer lead you into your battle of faith. Lord, I don't have enough strength, not enough courage, not enough confidence, but I know you didn't choose me because I'm strong. You chose me to reveal your strength through me. Please use me, even while I tremble, even when I feel like the least of all. But I am willing to obey. Pour out your spirit on me just as you did with Gideon. Teach me to rise, to blow the trumpet, hold the torch, and step into the battle. not with sword or spear, but with faith and obedience, for your name, for your glory. I pray in the name of Jesus, amen. Sow in action, reap a transformed life. If this video has stirred your heart, if your faith is reigniting, don't keep it to yourself. Click like, so prayers like this can continue to spread. Comment Amen if you believe God will use you just as he used Gideon. Subscribe to Prayer Station and turn on notifications so you won't miss a single story that revives your faith. Share this video with someone who feels too weak to be used by God. This might be their calling. Thank you for walking with us to the very end. This isn't just a Bible story. This is a call to a new generation of faith warriors. And you might be the next one. See you in the next videos at Prayer Station, where every story and deal is a calling.